Good afternoon. I'm Marian Bittler, and I'm the Interim Director of the Institute for Social Sciences, and I'm happy to invite you to our lecture by Jenna Stearns. These lectures illuminate the fascinating and important social sciences research taking place on our campus, especially by new faculty this year. We're trying to have people who are new to UC Davis give these talks, as opposed to calling on our folks who've been here for a long time. And hopefully this is introducing our new faculty to more people, although maybe we weren't as successful with that today as we might have hoped. Before I introduce Jenna, I want to draw your attention to some other things. So first, on Friday, May 18th, we're having a day-long training researchers to improve policy conference, and just to make clear what that is, this conference is intended to help researchers get their research into policy makers' hands and the hands of other people who are influencers like the media, think tanks, etc. Okay, it's a day-long conference. It should be really interesting, and there's going to be a panel at the end of the day that's some UC faculty, and then Dan Moraine will also talk about this issue with a perspective that's local. Okay. And if anybody is interested in that, and I didn't already spam you with this, you can email me and I'll send you the link. Okay. On Wednesday, May 30th, Kathleen Carley of Carnegie Mellon will present the 2018 Sheffrin Lecture in Public Policy, and her talk will be titled Social Influence in Cyberspace. And you can find out more about all these events on our awesome newsletter, our website, and a variety of other places. Okay? So presenting for us today is Assistant Professor of Economics, Jenna Stearns. Jenna earned her PhD at UC Santa Barbara and joined us this past fall. Her primary research interests include family, gender, education, and health economics, and she's particularly interested in the relationship between fertility choices and investment in human capital. Her current research examines the effect of family-friendly policies on labor market choices, productivity, family structure, education, and health outcomes. And she's already had her work published in a whole variety of places, including JHE and the JAP. Please join me in welcoming Jenna. You can see the title there.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about a paper that looks at the effects of tenure clock stopping policies, which are policies that allow new parents who are tenure track assistant professors at research universities to stop or extend their tenure clocks for 1 year upon the birth or adoption of a child. This is joint work with some co-authors, Kelly Bedard at UC Santa Barbara and Heather Antipola at Claremont McKenna. So in this paper, we're really interested in thinking of a little bit different type of family-friendly policy than the one you may be typically used to hearing about, something like family leave or flexible work schedules or something like that, policies that essentially change the time that you spend at work. This is a slightly different type of policy that instead changes the way we think about or we measure productivity around the time of birth. And so tenure clock stopping policies really only apply to people who are on the tenure track, right? Primarily at research-focused universities. We're going to more specifically, even than that, focus on the tenure and other productivity outcomes of assistant professors in economics. So before I go into kind of these policies and what we're going to actually do, I wanted to start with just a little bit of a broader picture of why we might think this same type of policies that again change the way we measure productivity around the time of birth, might be more broadly applicable to high-skill men and women more generally. So as most of you are probably aware, in the US and in many other countries, we still see fairly significant gender gaps in labor market outcomes between men and women. We think a lot of the remaining gender gap is actually a family gap, meaning it can be explained by the presence of children in the household. This is true even for very high-skill professionals, which is a little bit interesting to the extent that we think that high-skill women self-select into time-intensive careers, careers that require a lot of investment in human capital. So it's a little bit interesting that we still see these big gaps in their labor market outcomes. So here I've just plotted the share of women in 4 high-skill occupations that all require advanced degrees at age 30, and then again for the same cohort of individuals at age 40. This is the 1970 cohort. So the 4 professions I've plotted here are lawyers, doctors, post-secondary teachers, and then people in business. And the blue bar shows just the share of women in these professions at age 30 and again at age 40. What I think is more interesting, though, is the orange bars show the share of women in the top 25% of that occupation age-specific earnings distribution. And so what I want to point out here is between age 30 and 40, we see women falling out of these high-skill professions altogether. But I think more interestingly, we see women falling out of the share of top earners. So for some reason, women are less likely to move up within these occupations at the same rates. We have a leaky pipeline problem, not just out of work altogether, but a lack of upward mobility in these careers. So why might that be the case for these high-skilled women? Many of these high-skilled occupations have really rapid periods of human capital accumulation and steep promotion tracks early on in the career, in the first decade of one's working life. This is particularly salient for high-skilled women when their prime fertility years correspond to these really important years in terms of human capital accumulation and moving up in their professions. Additionally, these professions are often characterized by what we call up or out environments, or kind of ladder career structures, where if you're not promoted at a set fixed point in time, it's very hard to be promoted later on or to continue on the same upward mobility track. The best example, of course, of up or out type environments is the tenure system in academia, where if you don't earn tenure at a fixed point in time, you're out of a job. Okay, but we see the same sort of up or out type system in law with the partner track, in medicine, especially in hospital settings, in certain types of business and finance as well. Okay, so combined with the fact that this early part of your career that corresponds with prime childbearing years is really important. And if you don't move up kind of at these fixed points in time at the kind of prescribed rate, you don't succeed. It's perhaps not surprising we see these gaps, right? I think the other important thing to realize here is that even though we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the availability of family-friendly policies for high-skilled workers, both on the institutional level and also within specific firms, as I mentioned earlier, many of the typical family-friendly policies that we think of, like family leave, again, the ability to have a more flexible work hour schedule, etc., don't adequately account for the fact that the productivity shock associated with having a child is fairly large and persists a lot longer than in the case of family leave, just a few weeks surrounding the birth. Additionally, these policies, again, all just change the time where you're expected to be physically present in the office, and they don't change the underlying way we think about productivity. So if you're in a career where time at work and productivity are not necessarily the same thing, for example, if you're an academic and your productivity is based on how many publications you publish over your whole career, and not how many sales you bring up conditional on actually being at work, then these policies that change the time that you have to be physically present at work aren't going to really be enough to overcome this fact that having a child is very costly. Okay, so having children may be expected, actually, even in the presence of these family-friendly policies, to reduce the probability that women are promoted because your early productivity still falls. So we want to think, again, of a different type of family-friendly policy, one that's going to change the way we measure productivity around the birth. And we're going to do this by looking at tenure clock stopping policies. So tenure clock stopping policies are policies that have been adopted by primarily research universities over the past few decades that allow assistant professors on their tenure track to stop or extend their tenure clock for 1 year upon the birth or adoption of a child. Yes?
So you may be getting to this, but is there any examples of law firms or hospitals trying this type of policy, like giving extensions on the partnership track, or they just don't even?
So there's been some very independent cases I know about in law, where certain law firms have kind of changed the requirements for mothers. Typically, for example, in law, if you're on a partner track, you're expected to have some absurd number of billable hours a year. over your entire career. And again, the same problem kind of exists in law for the most part, where even if you're like technically on maternity leave or something like that, you're still supposed to have been accumulating those billable hours.
Right.
And so again, there's a couple of kind of, not systematic by any means, but a couple of law firms that have tried to essentially really think about maternity leave as a true time away, or to kind of accommodate more of a temporary, and the key in all of this is a temporary part-time work schedule that doesn't interfere or changes the way they kind of evaluate billable hours during that particular period, but it's not widespread. And law, I think, is particularly bad for women in the top law firms in the same way that the tenure track is, in terms of, you know, it really is billable hours over a career. I haven't seen anything in medicine similar to this, but you might think that you could implement kind of the same thing, again, especially in hospital settings that are quite closely tied to an academic structure.
Do you think it matters at all that law and medicine, people also typically have accumulated really big debts before they go to their jobs, as opposed to, you know, academia, some people do, but I think most people getting PhDs in econ don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would imagine that would matter to some extent, but at the same time, you still see women in both law and medicine falling out of these professions over time, even though they have this massive amount of debt. And to the extent that, you know, they know they're going to have to repay this debt, that's not probably, we wouldn't expect that to happen. So I think, I'm not sure I would expect it to be entirely different, because it looks like something is still happening that's not expected.
Sure, I just wondered if you thought this played
Yeah.
into it in any way.
No, I'm not sure. I haven't thought about that, actually. I don't think it would change the role that, you know, a similar type of policy could play. I don't see any reason why it would prevent the existence of a similar type of policy. But I haven't thought too much about that specific case. But one of the important things about tenure clock stopping policies that actually might address some of these points is that they're independent of any sort of policy that changes compensation. So tenure clock stopping policies really just extend the amount of time on your tenure clock, the amount of time before you go up for an evaluation. They don't change your workload directly. They don't change compensation during periods of leave. They're completely unrelated to actual leave taking. So in the university case, for example, they're not tied to course release policies. They're not tied to leave of absence policies. All of these policies do is change the amount of time you can take before you go up for tenure. Okay, and again, you know, when we're thinking about debt or something like that, it's very, you know, so long as you need to have a job filled, it's not costly to have me versus someone else in my job on the university administration's perspective, or the hospital administration, or the law partner's perspective. And so in that sense, I don't think, you know, these things like debt or the time it takes to enter into your first job or something really affect the ability of these policies to work in the way they're intended, which is simply to allow you to reevaluate productivity around your birth. With tenure clock stopping policies, essentially, as I said, right, you know, the standard tenure clock, let's say, is 6 years. I would go up for tenure in my 6th year. If I have a kid now, I can go up a year later in my 7th year. The way the policies are supposed to work in theory is that that extra year is supposed to be totally disregarded when tenure evaluators are making evaluations. So my outside letter writers, the people voting on my tenure case within the university, are supposed to be told to treat me as if I'm still in my 6th year, even though I'm going up in my 7th year. So that extra year is not supposed to count, essentially. In practice, this doesn't actually happen, both because people ignore the directions that they're given, and because people are not given the directions that they're supposed to be. And there's evidence that both of these things go on. So, you know, understanding how people are actually making tenure evaluations is going to be important when thinking about the impacts of these policies. Because if the time is not actually disregarded or discounted, then the policies wouldn't be expected to work very well. Okay, so in this paper, we're going to leverage the fact that tenure clock stopping policies started to become common in research universities in the 1980s. And we saw a fairly steady rollout over time from the mid-1980s to the mid-2000s in the existence of these policies. The earliest tenure clock stopping policies were what I'm going to call female-only policies. They only applied to birth mothers, and in some instances primary caregivers, but you had to be kind of a documented primary caregiver. Over time, gender-neutral policies started to become much more common. These are policies where both men and women get the same one-year clock extension upon the birth of a child.
What do you mean by documented primary caregiver?
Essentially, you could not have a spouse that wasn't employed full-time, and you had to document that during business hours, you were home with the child at least 51% of the time.
That doesn't happen here.
So the policies that I'm going to call female-only typically are just policies that apply to birth mothers, if you actually physically give birth. These primary care policies that I'm going to code as primary care policies are policies where you actually had to have fairly substantial documentation. Again, today, these are quite uncommon. Typically, today, we either have truly gender-neutral policies or policies that are significant risk care policies, which means you have to play some role in childcare, and it's largely unenforceable. But that kind of significant caregiver policy, I'm going to call it a gender-neutral policy, where essentially and effectively anyone can take up the benefit. So we're going to leverage the fact that there's this large variation in implementation across universities over time. And the sample I'm going to look at, which is going to be the top 50 research universities with economics PhD programs, over this period, 50% of those universities are going to only ever have a gender-neutral tenure clock stopping policy. 20% are going to switch at some point from a female-only policy to a gender-neutral version. And then 14% have a female-only policy, and then about 16% never adopt a policy during our sample period. The important thing I should mention here is that these policies are adopted at the university level. They're uncorrelated with the decisions in any particular department. In our case, in a short talk, I'm not going to go into kind of the details about this with economics, but we can show the adoption of these policies are uncorrelated with department characteristics and future hiring decisions, and they're also uncorrelated with university-wide characteristics.
So I should know this being a chair, but in most of the cases, the gender-neutral policies, are they mandate or option? Do people have to take the 1 year? And if they have a child and they decide to go up after 6 years, are they still going to mandate that you ignore that 1 year?
No. So the mandate part of these policies is that it's automatically approved. So if you give birth, you don't have to appeal, or if even if you don't give birth, if you're a father and your wife or your spouse has a kid, you don't have to appeal to anyone for a special case of, oh, I need a clock extension. It has to be automatically approved. Now it's your choice if you want to go up early. And if you go up early, they're going to evaluate you based on when you go up and not the extension. Yeah.
So in all cases, the person that decides to apply, and then if it applies, go.
Yeah, and the key part here is that these are automatic. So it's not, you can, in some cases, you can get clock extensions for other things. For example, if you have a large medical issue or a medical emergency, often you can request a clock extension. And those are often at the discretion of the provost or the chancellor or someone else. These are automatically approved. But of course, and it's important to note, you can go up early. Yeah. So if you think your tenure case is very solid and you're going to get tenure anyway, you're not going to end up using the extra time. Okay, so in this paper, we're going to look at whether or not these policies, and specifically we're going to be interested in the gender-neutral policies, affect tenure outcomes and other measures of career success. And we're going to focus on how they may differentially affect men and women. So what we're going to find, just to preview the results here, is that gender-neutral policies substantially increase tenure rates for men, they're benefiting from this extra time or the potential to take extra time, but they significantly decrease tenure rates for women, so this is actually increasing the gender gap in tenuring in economics. We find evidence that this is driven at least in part by an increase in the top 5 publication rate for men. So if you're not familiar with economics, there's a very high premium to publishing in the very top set of economics journals. And we see increases in publication rates in this group, which suggests a change in strategy, which I'll talk about in some more detail. Okay, so I think it's important before I go into kind of the estimation and showing you the results to think about why we might expect these policies to work or not work, and why they might differentially affect men and women. So there's a lot of ways that these policies could theoretically work. I'm just going to focus on a couple of cases for today. A channel that changes how people are evaluated, and a channel that changes how people behave. So the first thing these policies do is just give people more time before they have to go up for tenure. So even in the absence of any change in your own behavior, either your own publication strategy, your own productivity, or your fertility choices, right? Without any change on your own behavior, the presence of more time is going to increase the probability you get tenure if you're kind of publishing at some constant rate, right? So you have that extra year to get that last publication published, you have that extra year to get the last paper out, etc. And so this is going to have a direct effect on publications, just through the time channel, regardless of any behavioral role. We can also think that in this case, where all this does is give you extra time, the way we evaluate that extra time is going to matter quite a lot. If men on average are more productive than women during the period around birth, then if these policies are not fully discounted, meaning that you're actually still expected to be productive during that time where your tenure clock is technically stopped, then men are going to look relatively better than women as a result of these policies. Okay, and I think it's not unreasonable to think that because women often bear the cost of being pregnant, they often bear the cost of things like breastfeeding, it's not unreasonable to think they're going to be more productive, less productive during this early period. We can also think that these policies change behavior itself. Okay, so ignore any changes in how people are evaluated. I know I'm going to get some extra time on my tenure clock, so I can actually change my strategy for how I try and publish early on in my career. Okay. The extra time may cause me not just to increase the number of papers I published through the time channel, but I also actually might change my strategy. I might say, well, now it's less risky for me to send my papers to journals that are high quality but have low acceptance rates, because if they don't get accepted, I have more time to try again. And I can always send it to that less risky journal later on because I have that extra time to do it again. Okay, and so this extra time may lead people, especially people that expect to use the extra year fairly productively, to fundamentally change the strategies they embark on early on in their career. Okay, even if I don't have a kid right now, the fact that I know I might have a kid before tenure, and so I could take that extra time if I need it, might be enough to have people change these strategies, again, early on in their careers. Okay, so if, kind of either of these things is true, if either the number of publications increases through the extra time, or the quality of the publications increases either through the extra time or through this kind of more behavioral channel, then we might have kind of this third indirect effect where department tenure standards actually increase. In economics, during this time period, about 80% of assistant professors are male. You think if some men look relatively better, even if women don't look any worse on an absolute standard, maybe they look a little bit worse compared to their colleagues. Okay, so if we think tenure decisions are at all made on some sort of relative standard, or if we think we're in a world where people are competing for a fixed number of slots, then these policies might have differential effects by gender because the extra time benefits men more than women. And then finally,
So that channel is like the childless person is at a disadvantage too.
Yeah, and then if enough men are having kids that they all, enough of them look relatively better, this is going to be expected to hurt childless individuals as well. It's not clear, and this is, how tenure decisions are made varies across departments. We're not going to be able to explore this very precisely, but we do see evidence that in departments where it looks like there's more of a competitive environment, or maybe a fixed number of slots, these effects are a little bit stronger. So I think part of that is at work.
So that's more conjectural at this stage.
Yeah, it's conjectural. I can show you some. Actually, I probably won't today. In the paper, there's some tables that show kind of differences by the department rank and stuff like that, and public and private. So if you think in private schools, there's more of a kind of fixed number of tenured slot type game. You would kind of expect it there, and that's what we see. I'll show you some descriptive evidence on fertility. We're not going to separate the results based on whether you actually have a child or not for two reasons. One is that the fertility data is from a survey, so we have some sample selection issues. The second is, again, I don't think, the one thing I do want to emphasize here is we don't think that this policy or behavioral change as a result of these policies would result only among the people that ultimately have a kid or ultimately use the tenure clock extension. Because, if enough people are at the margin of thinking that they might have a child before tenure, or they want to have a child kind of in the couple of years before or after tenure, and they're willing to at least entertain the possibility of changing the timing of their fertility, this could cause these kind of early on effects where you change your strategy, it works out, and then actually you don't need to use the tenure clock extension because it looks like you're going to get tenure anyway.
Option.
Yeah. And so because of kind of that option value, because we can think of these policies as affecting everyone who places some positive weight on the probability of having a child around tenure, we don't want to actually condition on fertility as a outcome. But I will show you again some descriptive evidence that suggests this does change fertility behavior. Okay. So finally, again, the policy might change fertility behavior. Right? You might be more likely to have a kid because this lowers the expected cost of doing so in terms of your career outcomes. Okay, so to test these mechanisms and answer this question, we've compiled two unique data sets. The first is just a list of the tenure clock stopping policies at 49 of the top 50 economics departments in the US. So these are departments with PhD programs. We want to focus here on top departments because we want tenure to be tied very closely to publications and not to other things. Like teaching, which we can't measure, but also that wouldn't benefit so much from time. Okay. The second data set that we collected, I think, is much more interesting. It's a data set that contains the academic employment histories and publication records for every assistant professor hired at one of our universities between 1980 and 2005. So this sample includes about 1,600 assistant professors who were ever hired as assistant professors at one of these top 50 universities. In the results I'm going to show you today, we're going to use about 1,400 of them using three kind of sample criteria. The first is that we're going to limit the sample to people whose first job is in a top 50 economics department. The reason we want to focus on people in their first job is to avoid issues with endogenous moving in response to having a clock-stopping policy. We also want a sample where productivity is measured by publications matches the work that they did while in their job. Okay, and so the second criteria is going to be to also limit people to limit the sample to people who started their first job within 2 years of finishing their PhD. We're basically just throwing out the few people who did long postdocs here. Postdocs in economics are relatively uncommon, especially during this period. Again, the reason for this, it doesn't really matter in terms of the results, but we want, because there's not that many of them, but we want productivity, again, as measured by publications, to match the work you do during your assistant professor job. The third sample restriction, which again doesn't really matter but reduces the noise in our estimates a little bit, is we're going to limit the sample to people who published at least 2 papers within 8 years of finishing their PhD. This, our sample is people who get an assistant professor job at a top 50 university. They're all publishing. The people we're throwing out here is just a handful of people who leave after 1 or 2 years. They were never on the margin of getting tenure. They always go to the private sector and never show up in academia again. Okay, so the reason we're kind of conditioning on publishing here and not just spending at least 2 years in the university is we want to allow people to move into other jobs that might translate back into academia. So for example, some people go to the Fed or something like that. They're still active, they're still researching, and often they show back up in a tenure track job later on. But again, none of these sample restrictions make much of a difference in our results. In the paper, there's robustness checks that show we can relax all of these and nothing really changes. Okay, so I'm going to show you results on a couple of different outcomes. Our main outcome today is whether you get tenure at what we're going to call the policy university, the university at which you start your first job. I'll also show you what happens to the probability of getting tenure in the profession at any college or university in the world at any time. I'll show you measures of academic productivity as measured by publications. And then I'll show you some measures of time to tenure and mobility. And then again, some very descriptive evidence on fertility. These are kind of hard to see, sorry, but the one thing I do want to mention is our sample is mostly male. If you look at this top graph over here, this is the average number of assistant professors hired over time in our sample. You can see that about 80% of the sample is male. There's a small uptick in the share of women hired at the very end, but it's quite small. Okay, so we're going to identify these effects using a simple panel model. This equation looks very complicated, but really what we're going to focus on is just this beta 1 and beta 2 coefficient. Beta 1 is going to be the effect of being hired at one of these top 50 universities in a period where a gender-neutral tenure clock stopping policy is in place. And then for men, and then beta 2 is going to be the additional effect for women. Beta 5 and beta 6 are going to be those same effects for men and women of having a female-only policy in place. So we're going to allow the effects of these gender-neutral policies and the female-only policies to potentially differ. And then we're just going to allow the very early years after policy implementation to have different effects. The reason we're going to do this is there's a lot of reasons to think that it might take some time for these policies to work. For example, you might think no one wants to be a first mover. You don't want to be the first person in your university or your department to use this new type of policy. Additionally, if you think any of the effects we're going to find work through changing tenure standards or changing cultural norms or changing fertility outcomes, it might just take some time for that to happen. So I'm going to show you results for the very first couple of years after policy adoption and then the later years.
I'm just trying to understand, do you have multiple observations for the same individual?
So yes, we actually have quite a nice data set that has what happens to each individual in every year. The regressions I'm going to show you, we're going to have one observation per year. So for example, do you eventually get tenure in your first job?
So how long do you follow them after being hired? Like a
Yeah,
decade,
so
or?
we follow them in our data forever. I'll show you, I think in our main results, this is do you ever get tenure in your first job? When I show you results for things like publications, it will be by a specific point in time. So for example, how many publications do you have by your 7th year or by your 8th year or something like that? So everything we're going to run is going to be one observation per person.
And then when do you turn on the gender neutral policy variable?
It's going to be tied to when you're hired.
So if it was in place when you're hired, it's on
Forever.
forever.
So we've played around with kind of the timing, so you might think, maybe it matters if there's one by the time you should have gone up for tenure or something like that. It doesn't really matter very much how we code this. The reason we're doing it this way is that when policies are implemented across universities, sometimes they're implemented retroactively in the sense that, if I'm a third-year assistant professor and a policy is implemented and I had a kid last year, it would apply. Sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes it would only apply to people coming in. And so we want to kind of hold the information that about the policy that you had at the time you started your job constant here. But again, it doesn't really matter how we code it.
So again, just to understand, for each individual, it's either on or off.
Exactly.
There's
no variation across individuals. Do you have a policy when you're hired or not? Okay, we can also control for a bunch of time-varying university controls. We can control for a couple of time-varying individual-specific controls. And then we're going to include gender-specific year fixed effects for the year you're hired and university fixed effects. These are going to be important because there are some fairly substantial time trends in both hiring and the type of person that universities are hiring over time. Okay, so this is the main result of the paper. This table shows the effect of the clock stopping policies on the probability that you get tenure in your first job at the policy university. So in this red box I have, this is that beta 1, the effect of being exposed to a gender neutral clock stopping policy when you're hired for men. And you can see it increases the probability of getting tenure by about 17 percentage points. So this is quite a large effect. Tenure rates are not super high, they're around 35% in this sample.
Are they time varying?
Tenure rates?
Yeah.
A little bit. So this is the tenure rate for men and women, not conditional on anything. This is just kind of the raw data, so not conditional on clock stopping policies.
Wow.
So there's a little bit of an upward trend over time, but they're fairly low. And then this shows the effects of the clock stopping policies for women. This is the total effect. Tenure rates go down by quite a lot, by 19 percentage points. So this is dramatically increasing the gender gap in tenure rates. Some of this is coming through diverging trends. In this period, in the absence of the policies, tenure rates for men were rising and tenure rates for men were falling and tenure rates for women were rising, and this is essentially undoing that, any progress that was being made over this period. The other interesting thing to see here is that if you look at the female-only policies, we see absolutely no effects for either men or women. So the female-only policies should have only applied to women. There shouldn't be an effect for men. But they didn't really seem to work for women either. They didn't increase tenure rates. Although I will say we always see fairly small and insignificant point estimates. They are always positive. Okay, so they didn't hurt women, I think we can safely say. We don't see any evidence that the policies had immediate effects. It does take a little bit of time for them to develop. Just consistent with this idea that there's some learning going on, or some strategic behavior. Okay, we can also look at effects on other labor market outcomes. And the really interesting thing here is even though we see these huge effects on the probability of getting tenure in your first job, we actually don't see any significant effects of gender-neutral policies on the probability that women eventually get tenure anywhere in the profession. Okay, so they're starting, this is a sample of people who are starting at the top 50 universities. These are very high academically oriented, or research-oriented jobs. This shows the probability that they eventually get tenure at any college or university in the world. So, they're certainly going somewhere else, but they're not leaving academia altogether. And you might think kind of the obvious channel here would be, well, they're just getting worse jobs, right? They don't get tenure at a top 50 university, they move somewhere much lower ranked or worse ranked. It's actually really hard to measure changes in rank over a 30-year period, but we have looked at whether or not people are moving to higher or lower ranked universities.
Within the 50?
No, anywhere. So yeah, so these are kind of institution specific. So if you start at Harvard, we're going to say if you move to MIT, that's not a lower ranked university, but if you move to Davis, that would be a lower ranked university. But if you start at Davis and you move to a similar so we're allowing the scale. We're not looking just in and out of the top 50. We're allowing kind of what's coded as moving to lower ranked if you start at Harvard is different than if you start at the University of Oregon or something like that. But when we do this, it's admittedly a little bit of a noisy measure of rank here. We don't actually see any strong evidence or any evidence at all that women are systematically moving to lower ranked universities. They're actually less likely to move down. They're not statistically more likely to move up. That means they're making fairly lateral moves. Again, these are noisy rankings, but there's no systematic reason to think that women are losing their job in the top 50 and they're all going to community colleges or they're all going to CSUs, for example. And so this suggests, I think, that this is not all just a negative productivity story, right? It's not just that women now are having more kids before tenure and therefore they're less productive and therefore they're, leaving research or leaving these high-quality jobs. It does look like there's some sort of relative standard here where maybe women look a little bit worse within their own department, but in terms of the market as a whole, they don't. The other thing I'll just point out really quickly is that we do see evidence that they're staying longer as a result of these policies. So men are about 10 percentage points more likely to take at least one extra year on their tenure clock, so are women, although it's not statistically significant.
Wouldn't the relative standard explanation also make sense of the 3-year gap, where you don't look bad relative to anyone at the beginning, but you have to accumulate 3 years worth of people to compare yourself to for this effect to show up?
Yeah, so it would take some time for the effect to emerge. And yeah, so these are all these kind of longer term effects. Yeah, so we don't see anything for the just early years. We can combine them all together. It doesn't really change because there's a lot more years not in the first couple. But we don't ever see anything, and it's in the paper, in those early years.
And you may get to this, but are you going to look at actual productivity as well?
Yeah. So this is just descriptively kind of the number of publications that people in our sample have by the 7th year after completing their PhD. You can see men on average publish a little bit more than women. In the absence of a policy, there's not systematic differences across schools that will and will not adopt. But it is a little bit interesting, though, that men just publish more in general. So here are the effects of the policies on publishing. So this first 4 columns shows the effect on the number of top 5 publications by year 3, 5, 7, and 9. And so we've just shown a variety of years here because publishing takes some time. It's not clear where we would expect to see effects ex ante. So we see a couple of interesting things here. One is that for men, when they're exposed to gender-neutral clock-stopping policies, it does appear that they're changing their publication strategies a little bit. They're significantly more likely to have a top publication, or this is actually the number of top publications, once these policies are implemented. And it starts to show up around year 5. So it does look like they're kind of changing their, to the extent it takes a couple years to get a top publication actually published, it does look like they're changing their strategies relatively early on, if this is in fact the explanation. The effect, what's really nice here is it kind of peaks right around the time that these men are going up for tenure, around year 7 or year 8. And then it's fairly stable after that. So there's no catch up after tenure, essentially. For women, we don't see the same thing. For women, if anything, the point estimates are negative, although they're pretty small and noisy. There's no evidence, right, that this is helping them publish better. And if we look at all publications, there's no effects for men, but women actually, the point estimates get a little bit bigger, and again, they're not significant, but it does suggest maybe there's some small negative productivity effect for women. If you take these point estimates at their face value, again, they're not significant, but by the time they go up for tenure, they'd have on average one less non-top 5 publication than in the absence of the policies.
So sorry, does that affect, does that effect on men also suggest that if we were to move, say, the standard for tenure from 7 years to 9-10 years, we would gain actually one top publication per person from just that policy?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, so I think you need to think about whether or not there'd be broader distributional consequences in the profession as a whole. But to the extent that, there's some random component of getting
So,
lucky
the
at top
attempt would be
journals,
we're
I think you could expect
undershooting
that.
for the top early on,
Yeah.
and either more emphasis on
Yeah.
that, or just making
Well,
the time longer with.
Yeah, so I think the thing here is that, you need to have papers accepted by the time you go up for tenure. You know it's going to take a long time to go through the initial referee process. Even if you get an R&R, it can take years of revisions. And so at some point you're going to have to take a gamble. You're going to say, am I going to try again and send it to my second or third top 5 journal? Or am I going to send it slightly below where I know the probability of having it accepted by the time I go up for tenure is higher? And as we move that time constraint, especially in economics where this publication process is particularly long, I think there's reasons to think that you would expect this to happen more broadly.
I'm not suggesting that you should necessarily do this, but I think it'd be so interesting to see a similar study in a field that it doesn't take 2.5
Yeah.
years to get things published.
Yeah.
Because that's what's driving a lot of the strategic response.
I agree.
We could get things accepted in, say, 2 months or 3 months. I think the science
And the
is.
sciences, yeah. It's
I mean, there are different issues there with funding and lab space, but it is.
Okay, just very briefly, here's some descriptive evidence on fertility. To get fertility information, we did a survey. We surveyed everyone in our sample for whom we could find a valid email address. Some of you responded kindly. We have a really high response rate. We had a 65% response rate, but it's highly selected. So interpret this as descriptive. But we do see evidence. These are just means here and then differences in means. But the probability of having any birth before tenure goes up pretty substantially when clock stopping is available for men. The difference in the point estimates is quite similar for women. Actually, it's not statistically significant difference, but again, these are pretty small samples for women. The number of births also goes up. And then the last 2 rows show the probability of ever having a child, so at any point, and then the total number of children, and we don't see differences, would suggest this is really an intensive margin effect, right? People are shifting the timing of their fertility. They're not having additional kids that they didn't want or they wouldn't have wanted in the absence of the policy. Okay, so very briefly, to conclude, we find in this paper that these gender-neutral clock-stopping policies have pretty substantial unintended consequences for women, leading them to be substantially less likely to earn tenure in their first job, although we don't find evidence that they leave academia altogether. These results are driven by increases in male publishing to some extent and are consistent with the idea that these policies may be pushing up the tenure bar. We're not seeing, huge negative effects on female productivity that would be consistent with these lower tenure rates. So to address Anne's point, I think, what we need to think about going forward here is that economics may just be fundamentally different than other fields. The publishing process is very long. There's a really high return to top journals that we don't see to the same extent in other fields. We don't, for the most part, do postdocs. We don't have labs. We don't have many co-authors, right? Economics is just different for a lot of reasons. And so I think from a policy perspective, as universities are considering whether these policies are good or bad or right or wrong or we need future changes, it's important to consider that, these results may be specific to economics, and we do need more research to know whether or not this would be true in the lab-based sciences or in disciplines where you publish books to get tenure instead of journal articles, etc. I think there's reasons to think that, if you think that in many fields people are time constrained in the tenure process, you would expect to see similar results. Again, though, I do think some of the big magnitude here may be driven by the specifics in economics. And hopefully at some point we'll have more evidence from different fields to suggest whether or not this is true. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in terms of thinking about whether we should get rid of these policies, it's important to mention that the female-only policies, at least in economics, didn't work. And one of the reasons, anecdotally, they didn't seem to work, not just in economics, but across all disciplines, is that women reported being told explicitly by their male colleagues and their department chairs not to use the policies for fear of retribution, right? For fear that they would actually be punished for taking advantage of these female-specific policies. And so that's important to keep in mind, not just in academia, but in the broader context of the labor market. One of the advantages of these gender-neutral policies is it gets rid of some of the social stigmas against use. And that potentially is a valuable thing in and of itself if we can get rid of some of these negative distributional consequences. Okay, so I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Any questions from the audience? One or two questions? If anybody has not, that hasn't been answered yet?
Yeah.
On your final point, I'm not convinced that having a gender-neutral policy actually deals with that, because it's still possible that, given the social norms that we have, having a male take is seen as subverting gender norms and super enlightened and progressive, whereas having a female take advantage of the same policy can be interpreted as gender typical and in the same light of not being taken seriously. So even though on paper the policy is the same, it might still suffer from the problems of the female-only policy that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I can only speak to use here and not to how people are evaluating use. But we do have evidence from a select number of schools, including the UC system, across disciplines, that take-up did increase. When these policies became gender neutral, it increased among women. In the UC is one example where they initially had a policy that only applied to women, and then they switched. So you have this nice experiment where actually take-up increased. And you see the same thing actually outside of academia with family leave type policies. When they're gender neutral, you see higher take-up across the board. And part of the logic behind that is potentially that there's less room for firms, for example, to statistically discriminate against women who use the policies when men also use the policies. Now, to the extent we think that, men are still going to work while using these things, or women are still more likely than men to take leave, etc., I think it's a little bit more context specific as to how people are actually evaluated. But in terms of being comfortable with take-up, I think there is a clear advantage to not limiting specific groups of people. One thing actually that I think is quite interesting that Harvard recently implemented is a policy that couples together a couple different types of family leave policies. So they still have a gender-neutral tenure clock policy where everyone can take the extra time on their tenure clock, but only birth parents, only birth mothers can take course release or get additional course release or something like that. So they're trying to couple together different types of benefits. So you're essentially making up for the fact that, yeah, maybe childbirth is still costly for women, but we don't want to completely gender the benefits to the point where there's, unwillingness to use them at all. Unfortunately, these are new enough that they haven't really been evaluated.
Do you have the ability to cluster men and women together as couples and then evaluate couple performance?
That would be really interesting. So we could theoretically match couples in our data that we know of, that either have the same last name or we just know. Our sample's not that big. There just aren't enough of them to really, I think, do anything that's statistically meaningful. But if you had data on more disciplines, you could certainly do that. And I think actually it would be really interesting.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
Jenna again.